you. Kia ora tātou. My name is Jennifer Nicol and I am a councillor at the Waikato Regional Council leading the Climate Action Committee, and I want to welcome you all to the first panel of the event to bring COP26 to the Waikato region. We've got a lot of panels throughout the week, always at 1 p.m. streaming, and I hope you enjoy all that there is to learn about what's going on overseas, to bring people together to act on climate change, as well as hearing from our local voices around the region. So the topic of today's panel is the Paris Agreement and the new science. So it's kind of a great introductory item to be starting on, because it's the science that's telling us that we need to act on climate change. And the latest science has come out quite recently, actually. It was the 6th iteration of the International Panel for Climate Change report, so called the AR6 report. And its key points that it's making is that we've really got to reduce emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees and especially 2 degrees by making immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions. It has actually also a summary for policymakers, which is really easy to read. So if you want to Google that to have a look, I highly recommend it. Some key points from that latest science is that it's unequivocal that human influence has caused the warming that's happening, that the scale of warming seen in the world is unprecedented, and that we are definitely seeing more observed evidence of the events that are happening, and that there's less noise in the data than ever before, and that the temperatures will keep going up for quite a long time. But unless we make these rapid cuts, we will actually really struggle to keep it below the agreed 1.5 degrees. And so that there's a bunch of other points in there, but I don't want to hog the microphone too long. So I just mentioned briefly on the Paris Agreement. So the UN is like 195 or so countries that are a part of this, and that they have come up in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. So it's an international treaty and it's legally binding, and New Zealand signed up for that. And so where we're at now is about 6 years down the track from there, and what that Paris Agreement really asked everybody to do is to contribute to changing our economy and social systems to reduce emissions so that we can stay preferably under 1.5 degrees and ideally well below 2 degrees. So last year, COP26 was meant to happen, but it didn't because of the COVID pandemic. And so here we are in 2021 with the first 5-year cycle happening. So the framework of the Paris Agreement is that every 5 years, the member countries will come to the table with a new target and plan of what they're going to do to reduce emissions. And you will have heard in the news over the last couple of days that New Zealand is pledging halving its emissions by 2030. And there's a whole lot of detail around that you can read up about as well. But the intention is that every 5 years, we're going to keep ratcheting up the ambition internationally from everyone. And so there's some critical kind of milestones to hit, and this COP26 is really important. So that's where we're at the moment. Also, we will be held accountable to meeting those targets, and we'll be getting recommendations on how to make our plans better and better. So in some ways, it feels like the beginning, which it shouldn't be, because action should have been taken many decades already before. But here we are, and I'm really happy to say that from my place in the world here in the Waikato, representing Hamilton, leading the Climate Action Committee, there are frameworks that have been put in place thanks to the Paris Agreement, frameworks like the Zero Carbon Act that the government has brought in, and then even our regional approach that we're doing. So I've got here to show you that you can't really see because I've got the blurring on, is we've got a climate action roadmap, which has some interesting detail in it on how the Paris Agreement links to our national legislation, which then links to some of our regional work, which is, as I can see, coming together to give us even more localized action plans on how to make a difference. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing, how we can all learn about this topic together and how we can act to make those a reality all the way up until it shows in the data that people are debating again in the COPs, the conference of the party kind of events that happen in the future to hold our country to account next to everybody else as well. So I hope that helps a little bit to understand from that perspective. I'm going to pass you on to one of the Waikato Regional Council employees who is very knowledgeable in the space of climate, and then we'll go through the rest of the panel to share a little bit more and have a bit of a chat afterwards amongst ourselves so you can learn as much as possible. I'll hand over to Blair. Thank you.
Kia ora. Ko Blair Dickey tōku ingoa. Thank you, Councillor Nicol. I'm a Principal Strategic Advisor with the Regional Council in the Strategy and Policy Implementation section. I've been working in the field of climate change for almost 2.5 decades now, and I've been following the international agreements as they come out of the UNFCCC over those years, and the local national responses to those and how they affect regional council functions. And they affect everything we do, and everything we do in the future will be affected, not just by physical changes in our climate, but also our responses. And that is the government's response with respect to pricing of emissions, and also the recognition that we need to work in a carbon constrained economy from now on. I've attended one conference of parties. It was a long time ago now, in 2002. That was what was known as COP8 at Delhi. And that was an interesting time internationally because it followed the two key ones of Kyoto and Marrakesh that put in the framework around the Kyoto Protocol. And also it followed directly a couple of months after the 2002 Johannesburg Earth Summit, or Rio+10. What I'd like to do is just talk a bit about, and Councillor Nicol talked about the Paris Agreement, but go back a little bit further and look at how science has influenced the way the world has changed. And you can see that some of the key agreements that have been made through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have occurred because the science has been made available through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We've just been talking about heard about the 6th assessment report, but back in 2001, the IPCC, and I'll call it IPCC just because it's easier, released its 3rd assessment report, or just commonly known as the TAR. And that really gave a lot of impetus to the climate component of the Johannesburg Earth Summit in 2002. Moving on a couple of years, AR4, the 4th assessment report, came out in 2007, and that very much, and we were at that stage working through the Kyoto Protocol, but that preceded what was known as COP15 in Copenhagen. And that was quite an important one. Started to work us away as international agreements by recognizing that it wasn't just a 2-stage approach we needed, like was covered in the Kyoto Protocol, where the world was divided up into developed economies and developing nations, where it was recognized that those developed nations had got rich on the back of fossil fuel emissions, and we needed to recognize and support the developing nations into their projects. But so I've just had something come up on my screen, sorry. What it did, it recognized that developing nations were fast becoming big emitters in their own right. And this was India, China, and the like. And that changed the direction there. So we had then in 2014, the 5th assessment report, which really for the first time started to provide the science that attributed changes to various changes or degrees of warming. And we got very soon after that, in 2015, COP21, the Paris Accord, where it was recognized that 1.5 degrees was a critical threshold that we shouldn't really exceed if we were going to not change the planet too much. So that's really where we head now. From that Paris Agreement, three things came out of it. First one was I mentioned before, 1.5 degrees was a key figure. And the wording, I think, was that we would keep emissions well below 2 degrees, but aim for 1.5. There was also climate financing, recognizing that we would change the climate as we go on, but we needed to support nations that were going to be affected, both in the physical effects of climate change, but also to transition their own economies. And as Councillor Nicol mentioned, ambition was built into it, because the way that the Paris Agreement worked was it moved from having an Annex 1 countries and Annex 2 countries from the Kyoto Protocol to recognizing all countries needed to be involved, but they were given the flexibility of saying how they were going to be involved. And these were called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And the NDCs that were tabled in Paris would only get us to somewhere between plus 2.7 and plus 3.5 degrees, which was not enough. And therefore ambition was built into this. And so this year we have COP26, and we've had the IPCC's sixth assessment report to support it. Now, the sixth assessment report has been the most comprehensive to date. We've had in 2000, or series of reports, 2018, some science that showed the difference between a plus 1.5 world and a plus 2 degree world, and it is significant. And then we had in 2019 the report on the oceans and the cryosphere and a changing climate. And we had in August this year, Working Group 1's The Science of Climate Change. So that is there out so that negotiators can pick it up. I think I'll probably, conscious of time, not wanting to take too much out of the discussion later on, but just to say that, and I think I've probably picked this up from somewhere, but I don't know where, if Paris was the promise, Glasgow's the delivery. Just leave you with that. And before leaving, I'd like to hand over to Lorraine.
Ko te atua te kaihanga o te korowai o te rangi Māori te korowai o te whakapapa, kua horaina mai I runga I a tātou, nāna nei ngā mea katoa, ka mihi ki kingi tuheitia potatau te wherewhero te tuawhitu, me tōna whānau, me te whare kahui ariki pai marere. Ka titiro ake a hau ki tihi o tōku maunga tapu, kei kora te rangi kingi, me te atairangi kahu e takoto ana kotaupiri tēnā. Ka huri a hau ki te wai o Waikato e tere nei, e ko piko piko ana ki tōku marae, ka mihi ki Ngāti Whākia. Kia rua tia tōku whare tūpuna ana ko kai tumutumu kei rākau manga. E mihi arohana ki te Waikato COP26 moto whakaako tēnā koutou. So kia ora, my name is Lorraine Dixon and I currently hold the climate change portfolio for Waikato Tainui. And I'm just hoping that my PowerPoint presentation actually works. Let me see if I can share it. Yeah.
We are defined by our land, our river, our history, and the kingitanga. We are a proud people, each of us descended from the intrepid voyagers who crossed the ocean to land the Tainui Waka on the shores of Kawhia in the 13th century. Led by Hoturoa, these tupuna left Rangiatea to discover a new land, rich in fertile soils, abundant wildlife, bordered by a plentiful supply of kaimoana. When Kingi Tawhiao fled the King Country after the land wars of 1863-64, he provided his people with an enduring message. Māku anō e hanga i tōku nei whare, ko ngā pau oroto he mahoe, he pātete. Ko te tā huhu he hinau, me whakatupu ki te hua o te ringaringa, me whakapakari ki te hua o te kaweriki. Since our Raupatu settlement more than 23 years ago, we have focused on building a platform that is stable and solid to realise the aspirations set out in Whakatupuranga 2050 and enlivening the words of Kingi Tawhiao. In the ever-changing global environment, our world, our future generations live in, will be significantly different to ours. So, our approach for moving forward is one that embraces change and focuses on developing our people. We have navigated through the highs and lows of modern tribal life and are now valued at over $1.3 billion. Our registered tribal members have grown from 20,000 in 1995 to over 74,000 today. We now have a unique opportunity to reposition ourselves so that we are fit for the future as we move into the next phase together. To realise the aspiration laid out in Whakatupuranga 2050, we must build on the work already completed and continue to make a positive difference in the lives of our tribal members. Me he mea kare kauana he whakakitenga ka mate te iwi. Te whakakitenga o Waikato members attended 3 workshops during the year and provided great guidance on where we should focus in the next 5 years. What we heard was that we need good information and data to support decision making, and that we must also work collectively to leverage activities to increase our impact. We must also build skills in our people so our whānau and marae can work towards achieving their own mana motuhake. There are some great opportunities ahead, and we are excited about what the future holds for our tamariki and mokopuna. It will require the best of ourselves to create a better future for this and the next generation of Waikato Tainui. Kia tupu, kia hua, kia puawai, to grow, prosper and sustain.
So this is Waikato Tainui, where we consist of 33 hapu, 68 whakakitenga marae, and we roughly are reaching 80,000+ tribal members. And Te Whakakitenga o Waikato is a tribal authority that represents tribal members of those 68 marae of Te Whakakitenga o Waikato, and tribal members elect 2 members from their marae to represent them for 3 years on Te Whakakitenga o Waikato. And for us, Waikato Tainui means people who descend from our affiliate to a recognised Waikato Tainui whānau, marae, hapu or iwi. So our roles across ngā tohu taiao are to implement the training program, and part of ngā tohu taiao is to advocate for climate change in relation to water rights and environmental activities, and to facilitate work streams to achieve a desired outcome. We have our Taitumu Taupari Taiao Waikato Tainui Environmental Plan that seeks to describe a position for Waikato Tainui with respect to the environment and to the context and perspectives of Waikato Tainui. We are excited but very serious about the new climate change initiatives, particularly in the training program and building the capacity of our people so that our tribal members can build again their capacity to be the experts in their fields so they can support their marae around the environmental issues and also be paid for being the industry experts. So this aligns with Whakatūpuranga 2050 and becoming part of world leaders and support self-sustainability and mana motuhake aspirations, and also managing their natural resources. So the iwi response to climate change is looking into what issues towards managed retreats for our marae and hapu that resides along our tupuna awa and our moana bring. Will it be another form of dispossession of lands again, where iwi, hapu and marae may end up being forced off their traditional lands, thus severing the relationship and connectedness to their taiao as part of their cultural way of life? So under the sustainability of our waterways, Waikato Tainui is very eager to look into solutions that takes the pressure off our waterways and reverse the impacts of those waterways. So for us, if climate change is the taniwha, then water will be its teeth. So for Waikato Tainui, in terms of investing, we want to investigate where we should be putting our efforts into climate change. And Waikato Tainui are wanting to do action now. We don't want to talk anymore, but action on the ground directly at our marae, so they can become resilient through the storm of the climate change. These are what we call the lifeline legacies for survival. We are looking to overseas to our Indigenous whanaunga all over the globe and to hononga with them and share what works and what doesn't, and to also look at what their preparedness plan for climate change looks like, in particular their resilience strategies and plans of action, all of which is mātauranga focus. So mātauranga is part of what we think is best science, but it's not taken seriously in the colonial world, but it should be. So in the Paris Agreement and within the preamble, it talks about the rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as the gender equality, empowerment of women and intergenerational equity. It also talks about recognising the need to strengthen knowledge, technologies, practices and efforts of local communities and Indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change, and also establishing a platform for the exchange of experiences and sharing of best practices on mitigation, adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner. We take our role as kaitiaki very seriously. Our role as kaitiaki is the very essence why we have survived through climate change. We continue to make the ultimate commitment to manage our resources at a stricter level than that of the national standards, and centralise this around whakapapa and whānau needs and aspirations to be the iwi, hapu and marae, to hold fast to the connection with our taiao while enhancing that precious relationship. This is to ensure that the connection and its relationship to our taiao addresses fundamental challenges of the taniwha called climate change. Our mātauranga, our Waikato Tainui, is a major part of the solution for us, and science and technology is another whatu that binds it together, but that whatu needs to be tight and in sync to address the challenges we face in the ever-changing world. So when COP26 tries for the 26th time to get things right, the leaders need to fashion their house with the humble trees of the forest that nurtures, protects and binds us together to ensure that we have a chance to survive in a future healthy world. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And I'll pass it over to Nikki.
Tēnā tātou. I ngā matawaka tēnei te mihi atu, kia koutou katoa, aha kōkō wai, aha kō nōwhea. E noho mai nā i tēnā koko, i te rā koko o te whenua. Arā, me pēnei te kōrero Aotearoa tuturu. Nō reira, tautoko ngā mihi ko mihi ngia, te tuakana e Lorraine tautoko o kōrero, mai te tīmatatanga e mihi ana ki te teitei me ki ngā kāhui ariki heke ihoa. Mai te tihi o te maunga tai atu ki te wai, ki uta ki tai, ti re haupai maari te hoki. And in support of Lorraine, my name is Nikiti Tōtaua. I'm a Pauarihi with NIWA, a CRI, National Institute. Our work has been very, very important in terms of the effects of climate, or climate has always been important to Māori. So within NIWA, there was established in the organisation by two parties to inform those choices, a Māori Environmental Research Centre and the National Climate Centre, who developed research programs specific to climate and Māori society. Within NIWA, this is the hub of where that happens, and it's quite important for us to sort of emphasise in that, is that our work streams under the Climate and Māori Society program primarily is providing advice to iwi, hapu and Māori business especially as well, on climate change, impacts and implications. We also provide counsel when asked to by central government and international bodies such as the IPCC, and provide assessments of different risks across the whole of New Zealand. The other one that NIWA has also produced is a range of publications which have been peer-reviewed papers, technical reports, popular articles, presentations and posters, which were prepared by Apanui Skipper and Darren King. Dr. Darren King is our expert in the climate change area. Probably the best person to be positioned in this and the most knowledgeable, in fact, within the organisation. Due to my role as relationship leader development, Lorraine has asked me to come on board to support the tribe, and which is very, very important to me because, as she explained, she expressed the hub, which is called Te Whakakitinga, which I am a rep on as well. So I'm not only working in the science and technical end or the research end, but also from a tribal end, making sure and ensuring that education towards those tools on climate change, on greenhouse gas, which is really important because we're pretty proactive in actually causing a lot of that damage without being educated. So in terms of what we would, or what I would understand in those impacts is with the Paris Agreement, although the focus is mainly on greenhouse gas mitigation or dealings, we do very, our research is very, or contributions are quite minimal. Aaron also expressed to me to emphasise at best, we promote the development of emission profiles for iwi hapu authorities, and we provide perspectives on policies such as recommendations given in the recent Climate Change Commission report. Pretty much, if I was to look at our CRI involvement, that's pretty much as basic as I can cover. But the important thing would be, as to support the presentation that was given by Lorraine, is that it's also important for us to, through our Māori, Climate and Māori Society program, we're able to walk alongside Waikato Tainui. In saying that too, we need to look at the relationship and the engagement with a more solid and firm focus. And of course, at the moment, we're going through with Waikato Tainui and various other parties and connectivities to it, Tainui Group Holdings, and Whānau and Hapu, on a mandated document called a Memorandum of Understanding, yet to be achieved. Nō reira e rauranga tira mā, e mihi atu neina kia koutou, mo te manaakitanga me te wāhanga mōku hei kōrero. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity, as brief and short as it is. I did learn a lot about the Paris Agreement over the weekend, because in my mind, I have not really grew any further than my work capacity or role or responsibility, but now I have a real good and much better focus on it. Nō reira, kia ora tātou. And I would like to hand it over to, is it you, Louis, the handsome guy in the bottom left corner?
It's actually me, Nikiti.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana ki ngā iwi o Waikato Tainui, ngā iwi manaaki i ahau. Ko Aotearoa kapu o te aka mātuatua ki te whare wānanga o Waikato, ko Margaret Barber tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm Margaret Barber, the Dean of Science at the University of Waikato. So my expertise is in plant science, and my research has particularly focused on the environmental effects of plants, both crop plants and also managed and native forests. So I've worked on this for many years, and in fact, when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor was one of the people who was on the Australian delegation who went to Kyoto to negotiate the protocol, the agreement over there. And so that was a weird time for me as a student. I didn't have access to my supervisor, but I did have access to some discussion on what it's like to be in those situations when you're talking about science, but in a political context. It's not something I wanted to engage with myself, but an interesting outsider's perspective nonetheless. So the Kyoto Protocol was really one of the very first steps to the world taking on this issue of climate change. And the scientists were pretty sure that we needed to do something really serious about it in the mid-90s when the Kyoto meeting happened. But then, you know, other things got in the way. And some of the major emitting countries, they didn't meet their commitments and they actually backed out of the protocol. So when the Paris Agreement was organised and agreed to in 2015, there was a great celebration among scientists. Yay, we're finally being listened to, because countries were committing to reductions in emissions and they were committing to changing the way our business worked and our society worked. And then a couple of you have already mentioned the IPCC report, which came out earlier this year, which made it really, really clear that scientists are absolutely certain that the climate is changing, that humans are causing it, and that we need to do something really, really soon. And it's not just scientists saying this now. People all around the world are seeing wildfires and they're seeing floods, and they're seeing storm surge and sea level rise affecting their land and their waterways. And so as a scientist, I feel like the people around the world are getting behind us and agreeing with us, but our leaders are not. And I was really disappointed this morning to read that the G20 meeting failed to reach agreement on phasing out coal. So disappointing, because that absolutely needs to happen. It needs to happen fast. And that has unfortunately been blocked, it seems, by Russia, China and Australia, which is, I think, very disappointing. So there was some sentiment in the press this morning that perhaps the Paris Agreement is floundering somewhat. I really, really hope it's not, and I'm quite hopeful that we can agree to reduce emissions and that they'll be fast enough to stop the very worst impacts of climate change. But I'm actually, as a scientist, I'm kind of interested in why people like me have been saying for 3 decades, this is a big problem, we need to do something about it. Why is it that we're being ignored? And there's all sorts of interesting ideas that in the end seem to come across as conspiracy theories, but things like, well, there were big fossil fuel companies who were talking to the politicians, or maybe there was some religious ideology that was guiding them, or they're just narcissists who work with the media and ignore experts. So all of those things are probably contributing to it. But I think what it really boils down to is that climate change is a really complicated issue that spreads its tentacles into all aspects of life on Earth, and that makes it really tricky to deal with. If it was just about the science, we would have solved it quite some time ago. But because it blends into economics and politics, it becomes and equity issues and even colonialism, it becomes really quite tricky for people to actually deal with it. And so maybe I could just give you an example from my own life. When I was working in Australia, I had an opportunity to talk to the Prime Minister of the time about my own research. And I wanted to talk about climate resilient wheat crops. And I was working on developing different genotypes of wheat that would be climate resilient. And so I had this really fancy equipment that was measuring the exchange of carbon and CO2 and water between the atmosphere and the leaves. And I had other really fancy equipment that was tracing molecules of carbon and water from the atmosphere into the plants and back out again. And I was very excited to talk to the Prime Minister about my work. Unfortunately, she latched onto this idea that my work would be producing wheat that would take more CO2 out of the atmosphere because they were photosynthesizing more. That was part of the goal, but she extended that to being that this would help reduce carbon emissions. This is not what I meant at all. And she was about to launch into a re-election campaign. And so she was very distracted. And I wasn't able to explain to her that my work wasn't about emissions reduction, it was about climate resilience. Because as a scientist, I didn't have that communications training, and she didn't have the time and mental space to stop and listen to what I was trying to say. And I wondered if perhaps I'm a typical scientist, in that maybe I have an idea of what my contribution is, and I'm trying to balance communicating that contribution with maintaining my scientific rigor, which is very important to me, and that the balance is never right, and the communication is never clear enough and simple enough for the politicians to grab hold of and understand. So that was my disappointment from a while ago. And this was a Prime Minister who brought in an emissions trading scheme to Australia. It didn't last very long, but she did do it. So it wasn't like she was a climate change denier, as some politicians in Australia have been. So I'm wondering if what we really need is for, well, and other people have said this, I'm not the only one who said this, but for people in power to trust the experts who are saying this is important, we need to do something about it, needs to happen in the next 10 years. Either they need to be trained scientists themselves, that's not probably going to happen, or they need to be willing to trust their experts. Because what I'm scared of is that the PhD students that I'm training right now will be in the same position in 20 years' time as me right now, saying, I tried to explain it, but I couldn't, and they wouldn't listen. And I would hate that to be the case, and I would hate for COP26 to not produce what it needs to produce for all of us. I'll leave it there. Tēnā koutou katoa, and may I please pass over to my colleague, Louise Schipper.
Kia ora tātou. Ka ora te whenua, ka ora te tangata. When the land is well, the people are well. This is, somebody described my research group as that was at the centre of what we're trying to do. So my name is Louis Schipper. I'm a professor at the University of Waikato, and we are interested in trying to find ways of decreasing our impacts on the environment. And we have a specific interest in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Now, from the last Paris Accord, during that time, they came up with something called the 4 per mil initiative. And what they were trying to do here was that they said if we could increase the world carbon content of soil by 0.4%, 4 parts per thousand year on year, we could offset a huge amount of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so that was an enormous call to the research committee or community to look at ways of storing more carbon in soil. And so there's been a lot of interest in that, and particularly in Aotearoa. And the challenge for us is that our soils already have quite high carbon stocks. And so getting more carbon into those soils is quite challenging. And our work and that of other people around New Zealand has tried to look for those kind of solutions, and we're continuing to look for ways of increasing carbon stocks and getting CO2 out of the atmosphere. But one of the things that we have focused on also is that we need to keep and protect the carbon that sits in the soil. It's kind of the soul of the soil where it is. So we've got to look after that soil to keep that carbon there. And so while it might be difficult to increase carbon in New Zealand soils, we need to make sure we don't lose it. And one of the areas that I want to draw to attention here is the role of the peatlands of New Zealand. They only represent maybe 1% of our land area. They used to be and still remain some of the most iconic, remarkable ecosystems that we have. Kopuatai, Moana Tuatua, Whangamarino in the Waikato. They're quite remarkable. They're 10, 14 meters deep of old organic matter or plant material that is no longer decaying or slowly decaying. It's accumulated over 10,000 years or so, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, we have drained these peats, not all of them, but a large proportion of them. And we use them to produce food, milk particularly. And about half of New Zealand's peatlands are in the Waikato. There's a large chunk in Southland and a bit in Northland and scattered around New Zealand as well. So these systems, once you drain them, that peat starts to decompose. The air gets in, you get decomposition, and it releases CO2. Now, we have done some back of the envelope calculations, so they are what they are. But they might represent somewhere between 5 and 10% of New Zealand's total greenhouse gas emissions. That's a really big number. And so we need to find ways in Waikato, Aotearoa, and around the world to decrease the size of those emissions so that we can protect and hold on to that carbon. And maybe we can find a way of reversing it and turning these agricultural peatlands back into systems that are fixing CO2 out of the atmosphere so that we have a new Kopuatai forming a Whangamarino that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere and also contributes to biodiversity, right? The plants that we want to bring back the fern bird more and the lizards that are housed in these quite remarkable environments. So those solutions are tough. They require way more than just science, even though the science is really challenging. They require society, iwi, all of us, to try and find a solution that works for all of us. And this is not just important for us in New Zealand, but it is one of the key wedges that we will need if we want to solve climate change, where we do small bits together so that we can solve the whole problem. Kia ora tātou, I'll hand back to Jen.
Thank you, Louis. And I see we have about 5 minutes or so left. So please have a think about any of the panelists if there is another minute or so or a comment you'd like to make after hearing all of these other speakers. I mean, really, we've been thrown together to share our perspectives on this topic, and it is only the first panel of I think about another 11 to go over the next couple of weeks, which will cover a whole lot of topics about how to address things here in the Waikato as our contribution towards the bigger whole. For myself, I think one of the things that I've realized over the course of many years is that it is something where, as Margaret said, it is so complex and touches so many things that there really is no way to get away from it, to get these changes. So it is something for everyone. It is not a problem for someone else to think about. And one of the most powerful things we can do is to have conversations like this, whether they're pre-arranged or thrown together or whichever way, to get to know other people who know some stuff about this and figure out what we can do about it. And so, yes, I will just open it up to let Blair, or we can go in the same order as last time, and if somebody wants to pass, then just pass it on, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. Go, Blair.
Thanks, Councillor. I'd just like to comment on something that Margaret mentioned, and that's the link between science and decision-making and the communication of science. I think it's absolutely critical here. And the personal anecdote you shared there with the Australian PM, I'm just not surprised that what was the way things turned out, because when you actually look at how the climate change response globally has moved over the years. It started out as emissions reductions, and it really didn't pick up on the need to consider that these weren't working, and we are changing the climate, and we will have impacts, and we do need to adapt. The requirement for nation states to include adaptation in their domestic responses only came through 6 years ago in the Paris Agreement. Adaptation's mentioned there, but it's not really at any sort of level other than the recognition that we needed to provide financing. But financing is seen internationally in two ways. It's the way to adapt to a changing climate, but also to offset emissions through clean development protocols and mechanisms. You also made the point there about what skills do leaders need to have, and I've often been I've been reminded over the years that the UK is well advanced in the way it's treated climate change, and it's changing its economy to be a lot less carbon intensive. And it all goes back to Margaret Thatcher. She was a chemist. She got it. That's when the change occurred. She did a whole lot of other things, but she got this.
Would you like to make a comment, Lorraine? Oh, you're still on mute. Get you to unmute yourself.
I'm just making a comment of my little town in Dahui, Pōkeka in Huntly, where we have 4 marae surrounded by a coal power plant. And just recently, due to the nature of the Waikato River, where there was hardly any water, the power station was forced to find other ways to supply energy by, once again, burning coal. And the consequences of the coal emitting into the atmosphere over time since it was initiated back in when it started up in 1983, right up to today, we had that particular Māori community has had respiratory issues, the kohanga reo at the marae, high rates of asthma, ongoing respiratory health issues, as well as respiratory deaths. And as New Zealand is entering into and meeting the Paris Agreement, how was it that we're still polluting? And how was it that our people are getting the brunt end of it? They talk about tipping points, but from an Indigenous person, myself, and as Māori, some communities, like my community, the tipping point has already been tipped, and we're now having health consequences from it. So I'm just, this, like I said in when I was doing my presentation, this is this 26th COP. How many more COP meetings do we have to have until they get it? And I just feel like that our people, as well as other Indigenous people, are saying, right, that's enough. If there's no action right now, we're going to go ahead and do it ourselves and start preparing for the inevitable. And we don't want to be in that situation, but if we're going to have the more promises and no action, then I think that's the people on the ground, like our marae, our iwi, our communities, will start doing action themselves. And I think through the humble trees of the trout forest, who are not the global leaders, but the communities, Māori communities, and all of us getting together at the ground level, we are considered the humble trees of the forest, and maybe it's our time to shine.
Tautoko, Lorraine. Probably after looking at quite a bit of information and listening to all the speakers today, Margaret, probably the key thing in terms of the hub I'm in is there science or is there science fiction? And that's from a cultural perspective, a cultural view. And I think Lorraine elaborated that too, because that perception or that window from a cultural perspective needs to be explored. Probably the hidden truth that needs to be unraveled for the relationship, in a sense, for it to be culturally purposeful or focused, is a cooperation to understand, to draw a picture, perfect or imperfect, and be responsible for what we find. I think that's where Māori need to be taken to, and alongside everybody, because the science at a degree is at a distance for us, but if it's brought into our corner, into our forums, we're great to participate. And I think that the world of science is another career that's been an opportunity, and within there we've explored it through internships with Māori graduates. We really need that succession plan to be educated within the education system. And for me, I'm more forthright in saying that we now have kura kaupapa. We've had children that have gone through many stages of phases of learning, and then we try and provide them with a Māori worldview and opportunity to what's left, to now visibly bring science into that opportunity within organisations like CRIs, within major corporations, and especially within the universities. Probably that would be my closing point in terms of examining it that way. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I completely agree with you, Nekati. And this is why, as a university, and I've been involved in this quite heavily myself, we've developed this Bachelor of Climate Change, which has a very, very strong thread of te ao Māori, mā Tauranga, and Indigenous perspectives. So it has science, or Western science, but it also has Indigenous worldviews. And since I moved back, it sort of started to happen in Australia, but it's become really clear to me that we need to have a meeting of minds here, where alternative worldviews, including te ao Māori, I think super important, not only here, but for the world, to think of kaitiakitanga as a guiding principle for climate change, addressing our climate change problems. So actually, I'll just put a little nod towards the panel tomorrow at 1 o'clock, which will be addressing issues around gender and Indigenous worldviews with climate change. So I think that's going to be a super interesting panel. But I'm right on board. This needs to happen, and we should do it here in Waikato, in Aotearoa, because we can, because we should, and it's right. It's the right thing to do. And now I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Louis if he has any final comments he wants to make.
Yeah, kia ora, Margaret. Thank you. I totally agree with the speakers beforehand, and I've learned a lot on this panel. Thank you. While we say that we kind of know that climate change is occurring and we know the major drivers, we now need to start obviously focusing on solutions. And we know less about those, to be honest, and we'd like to think we know more, but it's not just about science, it's about all of what the previous speakers were talking about, and integration across cultural and social and economic boundaries to be able to make it. We need to probably do and learn more about a whole variety of different areas, because it won't be a single solution that helps us meet the kind of goals that we set ourselves, whether they're biophysical, cultural, social, or economic. So there are a lot of different areas that we need to bring people in. We need to bring in this enormous diversity of thinking, right? Different peoples, many different voices, because it isn't going to be just one or two people or just us that solves this. But lots of little bits where we work together, and personal decisions that we make about how we are going to get to work tomorrow, what we're going to eat, and the way that we're going to live, and the way that we raise our kids, right? And we respect the past and the land. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here.
Fantastic, and thank you so much. I've got goosebumps just from what an amazing lot of energy we have, in the sense that, you're all puzzle pieces of the Waikato, and so are our viewers when they get the chance to watch this, and all the panels that are to come. So I want to put out a call to action to those that are going to watch this, to say, please watch the other panels. When you see locals here in the Waikato that you want to connect with, go and take the plunge and reach out to them to talk about this kind of stuff more, and keep upskilling wherever you can, so that you can see what your place in all of this will be. I think we've had a great example today of thinking globally and how everything links together, but the only way that we are part of the solution is to act locally, and in Lorraine's terms as well now, like act really, really soon. So let's commit to doing those things really, really soon. Thank you, everyone.
The University of Waikato is proud to introduce the world's first Bachelor of Climate Change for the people who know there is no Planet B. Gain the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow. Contribute to a fundamental shift in the way we do business and go about our lives. Explore how mā Tauranga Māori can bring perspective to the most pressing issue of our time. Apply now and carve a career where passion and purpose collide.